Jerry can hear, and then it can be fits and starts. Ooh, all good on the screen at my end, Jason. Thank you, Jackie Clark. Very good. Okie doke. Well, welcome everyone. It's saying it's recording, so we'll get started. It's great to see everyone here. It's sort of on a Tuesday evening. The purpose of this was just if there was any comments or questions or points of clarification on the day we ran at the Clarks, just on what we've been finding out on grazing and multi-species cover cropping. So I've got everyone open for discussion. So like there's not much feedback and stuff. So if there's no problems, we'll go from there. So just question and answers, and I put that slide up just because sort of that's one of our practice areas that I took a photo of, and I think I may have showed it the other day. So same stock density, just different recovery periods between here, and the fence I use to fence it off, I just use a hot wire there where the dog's sitting. So so just jump in at any stage, and is there anything you'd like to make sure that I cover while I'm going through? Is there any comments or questions or something burning, but feel free to jump in. It doesn't sort of worry me at all.
Graeme, I could start with a question if you'd like.
Yeah, that'd be great.
The recovery period you discussed was somewhere between 4 months and 12 months. My farm is within half an hour of where the course was conducted at Jackie's place there. And the flats, our flats are blue gum on alluvial plains, which would be very similar to them, I think. What would you speculate the recovery period there should be?
The recovery period's one of those ones that it's sort of multifactorial, right? The problem is not only have the grasses recovered, the soil has got to be re-aerated from the roots. And then the other overlay for that is how do you reduce that rainfall risk? So to make sure that if you have any of those little blips, and I know people have been having bigger blips, but everyone's getting these inter-season sort of dry spells of, and what I'm seeing is that around that 4 months is a really good place to start. And it makes sure that if you have a month of dropped rainfall or something doesn't start on time or the season's late, that you skip over it because you've already allowed for that in your planning. So I don't go much below that until people can get an answer. Sort of I'm trying to write an article for the Stipend newsletter in that the people that are successful really simplify their grazing so that they can work out what's going on, and they're able to find a clear link between the action they take and the outcome that they get. So I tend to start people very long recoveries, one mob, very simple, lots of subdivisions so that they can control the stock density and do all that sort of stuff. So the rider would be is if your country rod is prone to going back to woody plants, so getting tree regeneration coming in, because once you've got the tree regeneration back, it's very, very hard to then shift it back. You usually need a lot of mechanical energy or chemical energy to shift it back to a grass. So if it's prone to that, you might be 3 months, but otherwise I'd be suggesting a starting point of 4 months. And if you started at 4 months, I'd also put in the practice areas and have some at 4 months, some at 6 months, some at 12 months, so that you can see, well, this is what would happen if I did this, so that you're getting that high quality feedback, and that allows you to use that feedback to then adjust. So you take your best guess, you start with that, and then you use your feedback from your practice areas, your trial areas, which is why I've put that slide up to work out what's going on. Is that okay, Rod?
Yeah, that sounds good. I've actually we lightened off, and I've gone to 6 months to start with, just to
Right.
see how that
Yep.
goes.
Yep.
And picking up one of your comments about regrowth of trees, we've got wattle and gum tree, and I'm just
Right.
toying at the moment with maybe bringing a couple of camels along to see whether they would
Yes.
tackle the eucalyptus. I don't know whether they would tackle the wattle, I think.
Yep.
So that's could be an interesting experiment also.
Yeah. And I'd be monitoring very closely if the stock density or the animal impact isn't high enough, you actually start to get the tree regeneration. So where they track or where you drive or ride the four-wheeler, there's usually trails that don't get any woody plants on them. And a lot of the time, the woody regeneration, I think, is because we're not getting enough stock density. But to get that stock density on big areas is hard work, is really hard work. And that's why I've been trying to say it's very inconvenient. And so how do you, do you know, like it's almost even like, in tiny places like what we manage and stuff, tiny country, high rainfall, small areas, do you know, you've still got to really mob them up. And that's why I've been saying there's two thresholds. There's the threshold of perennial grass recovery. Are you getting enough litter? Are you getting enough basal area or big bases on the perennial grasses? And are you getting enough stock density and animal impact? And I think you need to play with those very small practice areas to sort of work out, well, what does this land actually need? Where is the thresholds? And the big problem that I'm seeing is that the harsher or more arid, or we in holistic management we'd use the word brittle, so very seasonal in terms of rainfall and atmospheric moisture. That stock density is even higher. The thresholds go up the more brittle and more seasonal the environment. So so it's quite a tough thing to achieve. But I always say, if you know what it is in the small areas, in the practice areas, then you can at least work out what's going on. So I have a thing that I think unless we do these practice areas, most of us won't live long enough to work out all those interactions between animal impact and recovery and stuff. So the only way to short circuit that is to actually put in the practice areas. But start, like, 180 days is good if you're getting enough animal impact. But I'd be watching just to see what was happening with the woodies, and then you might have to adjust for that. Um, it's a very, it's
Right.
sort of working with nature is incredibly complex, as you know. So it's just, well, you've sort of got to be ahead of it, and if you can do something before it becomes a problem, especially with woody plants. Um, I don't worry about the annual sort of plants and annual weeds and things, because they're quite easy to get rid of and don't take a lot of energy and time. But the woodies tend to take a lot of effort and time. So I steer clear of
Gray,
them.
if I could,
Try and,
if I could
yep,
share some experience, that sort of country that Rod's talking about, that we get here in eastern Queensland, that river, high river flats with blue gum or flooded gum country. That's some of the stuff we had at Kaibong. And Rod, we were running something like 100 to 130 cows and calves on an acre for a day. And I was,
Right.
anywhere between 150 to 220 or 230 days between grazings. And,
Right.
I haven't been to your farm, but if it's down there near Bow Desert, it's a climate very similar to what we've got here in Gympie. And, eventually, once we got the biology working, the amount of forage that we had in front of the cows was astronomical. And
I
do you have
think
trouble with
ours.
woodies? Sorry.
What's that, Gray?
Oh, just quickly, did you get any woody regeneration? Was that an issue?
No, I didn't. Not that I could put hand on heart and say that anything that ever became a problem.
Yeah.
But so just
I
for
think
Rod's
for
benefit,
us,
having that huge bulk of feed in front of you for someone that's not acquainted with this style of management, having that huge bulk of feed sitting there for many months could be quite disconcerting, because we've been convinced by extension people for years that once the grass is more than 1.5 foot high, it's of no value.
Yeah.
So,
Thanks, Jason.
getting comfortable with this idea of having oceans and oceans of feed that could be 3 or 4 or 5 feet high, and lots of green and lots of brown and lots of yellow sitting there for 2 or 3 months not getting grazed is actually a very, very good thing.
Very good. Sorry, Rod.
I'd agree with that. Has anybody had any experience with what they say about camel saliva putting enzymes or something in the water so that into the trough, so they gets into the cattle stomach and helps them to digest grass that has become lignified?
I've read it and heard of it, but I haven't had any direct experience with it, Rod. So
that's fine. Yeah,
yeah.
Me too. I've read it and heard of it just recently, and I've talked to a cousin of mine who was running about 300 camels to clean up weed, but he hasn't got any evidence of hard evidence of it working. Anyway, that's a sidetrack issue really, so we'll leave that one alone. I'll just mention that our ground it's blue gum on alluvial plains to only about 15-20%. Then we go into spotted gum and ironbark ridges, so we've got a bit of a variety to contend with.
Fantastic. Anyone else? Any other comments or questions?
Graeme, I could throw in the one if no. Has anyone else got a question first? You mentioned low energy cattle were good to have.
Yes.
Does that really mean medium frame cattle that don't take so much to maintain? Is that what you're really saying there? Small frame, medium frame?
Yeah, it can do, Rod. Although it's not as straightforward as that, because I see some larger framed cattle that do seem to have a lower energy. So the calculation that they use in the Angus Society in the US uses frame score and milk to estimate the energy requirement. So it's not very accurate, because the other thing is it doesn't take into that ability to socialize and forage and do all those things that we also need. So the typical advice whenever people are talking about this sort of expert in this sort of cow energy area is to start breeding with the ones that perform very well, that have always look after them. So Joel Salatin will say this, Jim Elizondo, Johan Zeetzman, all them talk about starting them and keeping more of the ones that perform with your management. There's a woman that works for the MLA, and I can't get her name, San Jolly, and she talks as well about this type of stuff. Every time you do something to the animals, you select for that. And so I'm just saying, well, let's select for the things that are very profitable for us. And we've got people in New South Wales that have tripled their gross margin per sheep. So it tends to be the ones that have good subcutaneous fat reserves and that are sort of moderate frame to moderate milk. And I feel like we've gone far too far on milk. even down here, people struggle. They're weaning the calves early because while the cow's milking, she can't put on weight. In fact, she loses weight very quickly and needs lots of feeding and stuff. So um, yeah, so it's sort of a bit of a proxy, the frame score, but it's also to do with milk, appetite, foraging ability, time of grazing. There's a lot of work done on identical twin dairy heifers in New Zealand, and they find that the identical twins have a similar eating rate to their sisters and stuff like that. So it's like that thing that we need to just be selecting for those animals that we want. And most of the industry is selecting for weight gain, which tends to select away from fat because fat requires extra energy to put on. So if you do like a feed conversion efficiency, you end up selecting away from fat. We actually need fat as the reserves to get them through the tougher time and be able to forage on drier feed, but also to get back in calf. And the classic where I live is that they've selected so tightly for milk in those dairy cows that now they can't get them back in calf. So um, whereas we can put on weight on our cows between calving and joining, most people just think that you're making it up when you say that. So because we're moving away from that. So yeah.
That's good. Thanks, Graeme. Yeah, that what you said makes sense to me.
Yeah, and I think that sort of, when, my first exposure sort of to Santas and things like that in northern Queensland, I couldn't believe how deep-bodied and thick they were. They weren't very framey, but they were as thick as bricks and short. And I think we've selected away. And if you select for performance in the feedlot, you tend to select away from performance for people that are grazing. So I've been asking the Angus industry when they're going to start putting cow energy value on theirs. So they don't think I'm very funny. So I was. I don't know whether that comes through clearly or not. This is what I'm writing for the Stiper newsletter, and I've been trying to, and it's still just a draft and a work in progress. So it's like a download of my thoughts on where we're up to on grazing management. So, and I've put dairy down the bottom just because of the damage it does. So, which hasn't gone really well because the dairy farmers see themselves as the best grazers in Australia. So I put them down as the worst for increasing landscape function, soil health and profit while decreasing rainfall risk and fossil fuel use. So I've been trying to find a language to describe them, but they graze that perennial ryegrass before it, or as it gets its third leaf, so they don't produce any litter. They have to re-sow every 3 to 5 years, and they're using so much nitrogen that they're polluting all the waterways in New Zealand and down here. So I see it as a catastrophe, a real disaster. And then I put set stocking next, and down here be re-sowing every 5 to 9 years. The payback period's 7 years, so most people aren't doing that. When they have a dry season, they have a really big program to resow all the pastures, so they can't make money at that sort of level. So lots of inputs, lots of fossil fuel use. The one that's caused all the stress, though, is this one here. This what I described as rotational grazing. So not looking at the grasses, not looking at the leaf emergence rate, and just that ad hoc recovery. I couldn't find a better way. Short duration, 50% utilization, giving it a light graze, very much an animal performance focus, and occasional resowing, or people start looking at other sort of inputs. I find, like they're going to need something to hold the system up. And then the top one, I was just saying, like what I describe as full recovery, or that you've actually grown some leaf litter for the soil biology. It's really focused in on that perennial grass leaf emergence, and you're checking for recovery. Good landscape function. You need to get over that threshold for the stock density. Um, you don't worry too much about mixing it up, because the complexity of the seasons and rainfall and different, you know, physiological times for the cattle moves it around. So you've got to select animals that perform on recovered grass, and and shifting to that very low inputs and no reselling. So I'm not sure that works for people yet, but I just thought I'd share that as something I've been
Very good.
thinking about and writing about. Any thoughts or comments? Oh,
It's very accurate, Graeme.
yeah, I've tried to be accurate, but I always worry that we've all got our own confirmation bias. So I was trying to sort of pull all the research out to show, like, does it increase landscape function and profit? So the people I was talking to at Braidwood yesterday, no, sorry, today, they're going to make a profit this year. Um, their neighbours would suggest that when they're having good seasons, they're not really having a go. But as soon as the season changes, they're all wanting to adjust on their place. So they make steady every year moderate profits, and it's I just can't see how you make that sound really exciting. That slow and steady wins the race. Um, so they're doing really good grazing, very low cost of production, low rainfall risk. The plants are always growing every time there's moisture. So, they're going well. And now everyone's sort of looking, because they're the only people that have got grass in their area
All
of
the
the valley
time.
that they're in.
Yeah.
Which fits with what we know, Jason, as well, from Michael and Anna sort of have got grass at Holbrook, whereas their neighbours are desperate, sort of thing. So this is another thing I'm working on, and this is just to sort of stimulate some discussion. I've got the full PowerPoint if we wanted to go back to any of the things I said when we were at Colin and Jackie's, but I found it really interesting. I had people come here and live here for 3 days, which was really interesting for them and for me. It was that course, Jackie, sort of, and what I found is that when you distilled it, what people wanted to know, what they needed when they walked out into the paddock was, are the animals okay? Is the stocking rate okay? And is the land regenerating? So I've been trying to draw this in my overcomplicated way of doing things. I'm still working out how to simplify. I find I have to just do like a bit of a dump and then try and simplify from there. So, the animal's okay was all the gut fills and dung scores and contentment sort of thing, and using the photo standards. The stocking rate's much harder, because you've got to have that grazing plan. And if you, like for you, Rod, if you know that you've got 180 days, you can divide that area that you're in and say, well, what size is the area divided by 180 days? For 180 days recovery, I've got to eat one 180th of that area each day to get that recovery. And people struggle with that. And I've found that only recently have I realized that don't try and teach people a technique or a method or what you think's the most sensible. Work out what works for them. And this is what I've found, that when I'm talking to people, some people really like that in the laneways that the posts are evenly spaced, so they can count the posts and work out pretty accurately what area they've grazed. Others pace it out. Others use a measuring wheel, and some use a GPS and take it back in and put it on Google Earth Pro. So like from stepping it out to post spacing to measuring wheel to GPS, And what's really interesting, when I present those 4 or 5 different ways of doing something, people say, "Oh, there is only one thing to do," but you can't predict what it is going to be from them. They'll either say, so people that I think, like I go, "Oh, this guy uses the computer all the time. He's going to go for GPS." He goes pacing it. It's out. It's the only sensible thing to do. Someone else will say, "Oh, I'm going to use the measuring wheel." So if really, what I've found is that I've got to just say, well, this is some of the methods. You might come up with an easier one or something that suits you better. So it's not about ease. It's not about technology. It's about what each individual wants. So those barriers to working out that daily area, like that 180th of the area that you're grazing, that's very individual. And I just did never realize this. I try and teach people GPS or estimating it, or doing something, so and if you give people enough, they'll work out which one's convenient and works for them. But then, so once you've got that, you've got to have, I believe, the minimum viable grazing plan is to have the number of days, have a paddock plan, like an overhead paddock plan, and have the number of days that you've got to be in each one of those paddocks written down on that. We used to do a complicated grazing chart, but what I find is that if they've got the paddock plan, they're actually visualizing all those other things that we needed the grazing chart for. Like, do they need to batter some banks on a creek, or, tread on some manual, push them onto some manual weeds, or do something. They can do that because they're looking and thinking about it as that paddock, rather than having to record and do a lot of stuff. So, and then just planning and scheduling that we do. So, and again, using those practice areas. And then for the land regenerating, is the grass recovered when you're going in? You know that if you're getting animal performance and the grass was recovered when you went in, that you're going to get that land regenerating. And again, you've got photo standards and practice areas. So I didn't know whether, is that helpful at all, or is that too weird?
I think it's wonderful.
Down 3 flow charts.
I think that's Jackie? Good. Yeah, I think that's good.
Yeah. Oh, well, I can send it to you as well. So, yeah. But yeah, and what do you think about this idea, Jackie? Do you understand what I mean? That is that I've always tried to push people to do it my way, and it's actually, you just got to take all the things off and say you can do it this or this or this. Which one works for you? We'll do that. So
we've got a measuring. We just got a measuring wheel. And it's quite good fun. We do use
yeah,
but I think you like the measuring wheel. So there you go.
Just struggling to hear you.
That could be me.
I think it's because Jackie's away. There's a bit of space between Jackie and the microphone.
Oh.
She's sounding a bit distant.
Oh. It's not that. It's not that you wanted to be distant. Yeah.
Graeme, just go back to that slide. So now that you're aware that you're giving people a handful of options with which to determine the daily grazing area calculation, would it be fair to say that by having them take ownership of the best way to do it that suits them, it's going to increase buy-in to the whole idea?
I'm not sure it increases buy-in. I think people just do it, Jason. Do you know, like?
Okay.
Yeah, so maybe it's it might be splitting hairs or something. That do you know, like, I think what we do is, well, I think what I do is that I've been trying to get people to do things the way I think they should do them.
Yeah.
And a lot of the time,
the
complexity of, say, like using your GPS on your phone app and then trying to download it and find the area, like it lasts a week. Do you know, like
Yeah.
doing the full grazing chart, like we train people. Not sure it even lasts a week. I don't see people even starting it. But
Oh, that's
yeah,
right.
like if you, and this is another one of the people we work with, Mark Gardner from Dubbo. We were talking about this and doing how when the people were here, I sent them away with, like, I said, are you comfortable with having the numbers on your paddock plan? And yes, everyone was comfortable with that. Some said they'd still like to use the grazing chart, which is fine. I go, well, that's great. But at least people went home with something that they can actually look at and say, well, we're going too fast or we're going too slow. And that's really what, is the stocking rate okay? Is all about, are you going too fast or too slow? So um,
I suppose
lots of
in hindsight, buy-in was the wrong word because because you're giving them the option. They're taking more ownership of it because they're doing something they want to do, not something you've asked them or told them they should do.
Yeah, and that's what. So I stopped. Yeah, like I try and practice these things. So like I've done the post spacings. I've got a measuring wheel. I've had to go at the GPS, and at the moment I'm finding all of them a little bit sort of tricky for me. So I come back in and just look at Google Earth Pro and say, oh, I grazed from there to there. What was that area? Do you know? So that works for me. But I've tried the other things, and it's like it's that whole adoption thing that it's got to be convenient for you, and so convenience is individual.
Convenience.
And I thought so I thought convenience was a like a global type thing, whereas it actually is. It's different for different people, and that's like that was the surprising thing was that when I said to people, sorry, Rob.
Graeme, can I just comment there that from my experience in training in a different in the accounting practice, it is absolutely true that if you give them a range of options and let them adopt the one that appeals to them, you're going to get more hit every time. It's going to work better every time.
And that's that. See, and like you'd get this. We used to get people to do relative paddock productivity and times the area, and like they said, they'd be doing fractions and things like that in the grazing planning, and they just never did it. So if you do an estimation thing for that, that works fine for some. And then the ones that do want to do the Excel spreadsheet, they'll do it anyway. So so it's really just it's just providing people with those options. So, and I've just tried to put those practice areas to so you can determine the perennial grass recovery and animal impact thresholds for your land, because it's different for different land, and it's also different for different seasons. So you can get really good animal impact in the growing season, but you might have to really pull them in much tighter during the dry time of the, like your dry time now, get that material on the ground. So, and it's got to be a simple plan that will be used and maintained. So a paddock plan rather than a grazing chart is what trying to do this with Holistic Management International. We're looking at adoption. So yeah. So is there any other comments or questions or anything, Greg or Jared? If you wanted to put into the chat box, if you had any other questions or comments.
If no one else has, I should just let other people ask questions first, but if no one has one, I could throw another one in.
Yeah, sure.
Graeme, you explained to us why too much energy in the dung, going towards coming from feed that is too green is very bad for them. In the high growing season, and when a lot of water in the feed, a lot of green, what do you do about that?
Yeah,
How
well,
do you manage it so
um,
that it's not?
so that's where we sort of are now. Most people have got really low dung scores, and they're feeding hay at the moment. So the neighbour he calves a month earlier than us. So I took a photo on my phone because they were silhouetted all in a line up on a ridge, um, and sort of so we're quite green. If you haven't let it grow through that autumn break, then it's very young, and it's quite toxic. So the behaviour in our environment is to feed them to address the symptom of that grass being too young. They feed them hay and straw. So the dairy farmers is sort of running them on very young grass at the moment, and just to mop up all that non-protein nitrogen, they're feeding them a fair bit of hay and straw before they put them on the paddocks for short periods. So if you've got long enough recovery, there will be a mix there, and also anything that's started growing. So what we're eating now is what germinated at our autumn break, and so it's already got some age on it, and so like you, we manage it by making sure that the feed's old enough. So you're going to get you get a really powerful green up. That that spring can be incredibly intense with lots of young feed. But if you've got it mixed in with old feed, you've got at least something for to balance themselves up. Um, all the I typically had sort of the research that I'd read about sort of the cost of feeding supplements and hay was that it was at least as twice as expensive, and but I'd never seen the research done where they'd added on the cost of bringing the hay in and taking the hay back out, and it's closer to 4 to 6 times the
Wow.
cost of the grass. So if you can grow the feed in place, it's much cheaper, but it does take some of that management, and we can get, at that sort of, if the sun ever comes out down here again. So um, Darren Doherty described it as a poor man's New Zealand the other day. Like it's sort of so it gets so wet and cold at this time of the year. But yeah, so when the sun comes out, sort of mid-August, if we haven't been very wet, it'll be mid-August. If it's been very wet, it's sort of into September. We can get a real green flush coming through, and their dung scores will go down a bit, but not enough to cause any serious issues. So um, our we got like when we got some substantial sort of rain, we got a few dirty tails on the cows and a couple of calves that I was watching and trying to find places that we could give them the older feed, and then so we manage it by if you don't have any older feed, then you do have to go to you've got to be proactive and start giving them hay or straw or something that'll mop up that excess non-protein nitrogen. So that
Right.
that was the agenda we had on the day. Was there anything out of that? Does that prompt anyone? So I spoke about that costs and risks, and how do we make it anything we adopt is lower risk and lower cost. Just that landscape function and David Tongway's work on land and soil health. Just that plan infrastructure for planned grazing. We've talked a bit about that. Um, that pasture and improving. And then we just did a bit of a brief thing on the, what's your resource constraint, and talking about cover cropping if people were interested in that covers and stuff. So does that prompt anyone? Anything else?
There was another question that I had. That's okay.
Yeah, that's fine.
Or, does anyone else have any questions before I ask another one?
I haven't got any chat comments or.
Okay,
Jared,
so
have you had any
you,
questions or comments? You go, Rod. It sort of might help lead into other things.
okay, you described for us how grass should the head of the grass should grow, and that it can only support a certain number of leaves, so one dies off. I think it was that it supports something like 3 growing leaves, and the fourth one would die off. Do I have that right?
Yeah, it is. It's a bit different for different species, but that was perennial ryegrass, which is the one that's well studied, and some of the introduced grasses and the natives are 4s and 5s. But yeah, that's the
Okay.
principle of perennial grass growth.
I've been trying to observe it on Callide Rhodes grass. Does it do the same? It doesn't. Seems to me it holds more than the 3 growing leaves.
Yeah, and I'd have to look it up. Yeah, it would probably be a 5. Some of those natives, they have more actively growing leaves before that one starts to become litter. So the one, what I've been trying to say is that look for the litter, and then if you don't know how many leaves that species is supposed to have, is it 3 or is it 5 or more, then just look for the litter, and as long as it's got the litter, you know that you've got full recovery in that species. The key is to look for the litter in what you would consider to be one of your very best grasses, because you want that very best grass to recover. So, so has your very best grass got litter in it, or better grass? I do tend to say that, and then people go, "Well, what's the best grass here?" So, so your highly palatable broadleaf, some of the grasses, the very good grasses, when you set stock, they fall out, they get grazed out very early. So it's the ones that are hard to maintain. I tend to look to see if those are recovered, because if those are recovered, the lower successional, the not so good at grasses, they're fully recovered. So look for those better grasses and see that they've got litter in them. As a rule of thumb, works really well. So, and if you look for that recovery in the better grasses, you tend to get more of it over time. So it'll start to move into the community because conditions are right for it to germinate, establish, and reproduce. So it'll start to sort of shift into the community. So we need to be looking for those better grasses and then make sure they're recovered. So I put up photos of that cape weed and stuff, so I never ever looked or worried about the cape weed shading. I just looked at the grasses that I was after. Have they got litter in them? Are they recovered? Okay, now come back in. And over time, well, over a very short period of time, it pushes out those annual 4B weeds.
Okay, thanks.
Anyone else?
So Graeme, yes, I don't know, can you hear me or do you want me to type?
Yeah.
I can type? No? Can you hear us?
No, I can hear you.
Graeme, I was just going to ask, with the multi-species cover crop down the flat,
Yes.
what should we be looking at there? Like it's probably knee high. It's very vigorous at present. I'd say it's oats and rye. The rye isn't competing that well because we didn't do cereal rye, but anyway, it's there. And
Yeah.
there's turnip and brassica and vetch, and then we added a bit of like just little bits of beetroot and carrot and dill and celery. Just as a out bit
So
crazy, but and
yeah.
they're like looking good, but they were planted about May the 13th, May the 13th.
Yeah.
What should we be looking for? Same
Well,
thing, like go by the oats or
yeah, I'd go, by the annual grass, so your oats or your barley or your wheat, and I'd just be looking to sort of it's a little bit different because you're not actually trying to get it to reproduce with the annuals. What you're trying to do is say, is it going to go well through their rumens? So if the oats are looking like they're heading towards producing litter, and I'd say that they're usually pretty safe at that stage. Most plants, when they're recovered, sort of and going well, they lower all their toxins, so they actually want to be grazed. So definitely in the perennials, so a lot of those toxicity issues aren't an issue if the plant's fully recovered. So you do have to check, and you put in some sentinels and do all that sensible stuff as well. So yeah, Jackie, I'd be looking. So on that flat, are you looking to build ground cover and litter? I was just trying to work out how I could get to. Do you know that photo I had?
I should have taken
Let me
the
see.
photo.
Oh well, you can send it to me, and we can. I could even
I will.
send it around when I send around the notes or whatever. Do you remember that
Oh, sure.
photo, Jack? Can you
Oh,
see
yes,
that
yes,
one?
yes.
Yeah. See, it's from Gabe Brown's property, and that's with his um, cover cropping, and so if you're building litter, then you've sort of got to get that litter into the system somehow. So,
Sure.
oh, that was Cole Seiss and Gabe, and that at Ardmona near Shepparton. But yeah, so like the key
We
is getting ground cover and then getting that litter decomposing. So
we where the cattle were grazing on the field today. We tried some intensively stocking on that, and then that was good. And then Cole still mulched just to get the planter through. And
yeah,
it's probably not. It's not as dense as that. It's not as dense, but it's all coming through now. Like the oats and the barley and everything's coming through now.
yeah,
It's just very small.
it was a bit slower, was it?
Oh, we only like by the time the cattle finished and yeah, it's been planted and watered like a fortnight. Yeah, it'd be a fortnight.
Yeah,
Yeah. And
yeah, because
it's looking good. Yeah, I I should have done photos. Sorry, so you could just see where.
no,
Yeah.
no,
How
but
they
the
did some grazing.
yeah, but if you wanted to send them or whatever, I could send them around. But see, that's sort of, do you know, Gabe's been doing that for quite a long time. And then, so he's built this litter base up so that he's now planting through a mulch. So it's a different system than what we're thinking of. So I'm finding that's the biggest issue with the cover cropping is that people are eating everything. Do you know, like they're eating it too young. They get fantastic animal performance, but it's not improving the land like they want. So um,
Oh,
they get
sure.
really good profit out of it and growth rates and things like that. But again, one of the things I would do is look and sort of say, oh well, yeah, because you're moving around, these the oats and the barley and that are going to be getting older as you go. Um,
Sure.
and sort of just keep an eye on it, and then just keep monitoring what does the recovery look like when the dung score's going really well, and use that as a
Oh,
guide for when like in your environment with your animals, it's when the oats look like this, it's going really well. It's just hard to manage because you plant all at the one time, but then you're grazing it at different times. So
yeah,
um,
sure.
it's a little bit harder with the cover crops, so
Mm.
than with the grass. So than just grazing
Okay,
perennial
thank you.
grass. So did that help at all?
It did, Graham, because then we've got to, because it's all green, we've got plenty of old dry grass, as you know, so we can
Yeah,
so we can
you
also
plant.
restrict like we can also do
Yeah,
the
put them
strip
on.
grazing on the dry grass. That's what
Yeah,
we're
just to
hoping.
clean them up. Well,
Yeah.
do you know, with that cape weed, because it had really high nitrates and non-protein nitrogen in it, I could only put them on for a little while, and then I'd put them back onto fully recovered perennial grass to sort of clean them up and get them healthy again, and then I could go into another area of the cape weed. So, but yeah, it sort of bounces their rumen around too much. So. Um, I always thought they were poor suffering cows, those ones of mine, when I was doing that work. So, yeah. But yeah, so I'd be using that and just sort of seeing, because the key is getting that decomposition of getting the litter in place and then getting it to decompose, getting it in contact with the soil surface so that it can be colonized by the soil life to start decomposing it, the decomposing fungi, etc.
Thank you.
No worries,
Thank
thank
you.
you. Anyone else? How are you going, Jason?
Good, mate. Enjoying the webinar immensely.
Oh, good. It's a very simple one. Not too many
I know.
slides, lots of skipping around. I was just trying to think what else. Was there any other comments or questions? Did everyone get the notes on the different gut fill scores, and some of those things weren't very good on the slides.
The notes were excellent. Thanks, Graeme.
Oh, good. I'm glad, right? So there's the just some of those principles, and sort of I need to work out better ways of talking about early warning, and when we do daily and when we need annual and stuff. So any other thoughts, or will we shut it down? Is everyone happy? You sound happy enough, Jason.
Yep.
Right.
Yeah, that's good. Thanks, Graeme.
I hope that was, and feel free to send me any other things. I'll send the link to the webinar, and if you wanted to send some photos, I could send them as well, Jackie, if that worked for you. But if you were happy to share, so yeah.
Yeah, no problem.
Very good. Thanks for giving me an hour of your time. That's been great. So very relaxing and enjoyable. So thanks, everyone.
Graeme was great. Thanks, Graeme. Thank you.
Thanks,
Thanks,
Graeme.
Graeme.
Thanks for a good night.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.